Hi, I'm Paul Duchesne, and welcome to Mama Paul's video podcast. Today is Saturday, March the 13th, 2021. I'm going to do part 5. This will be the last part for the Powell Memo. The Powell Memo. I'll just recap real quickly, which I've been doing every week here. The Powell Memo was written in 1971 by Lewis F. Powell, who was a corporate lawyer working for the tobacco industry. He was extremely pro-corporate. In fact, he had turned down an appointment to the Supreme Court a few years earlier because he wouldn't make enough money. He took the appointment a few months after writing this memorandum. There might have been some added inducement, I don't know exactly. So anyway, he's approached by a friend of his who works for the Chamber of Commerce, and they want him to write a memo entitled "The Attack on the American Free Enterprise System." My contention is that this particular memo is basically responsible for Fox News, Fox fake news as we know it today, and in general the dumbing down of America, and also the rise of a lot of white nationalists and racist policies and ideas that we have floating around in the country today. Going back to 1971, Powell is responding to the hippie revolution of the 60s, which is both spiritual and political. We were attacking not necessarily American free enterprise, we were attacking the corruption within the system. The system had become extremely corrupt. And I've talked a little bit about this. I'm not going to belabor the point today, but let's just say that people weren't objecting necessarily to you going out and starting a business and raising some money and having a nice little business and making a profit and paying for your workers and things like that. We're talking about big business. We're not talking about small-scale capitalism. We're talking not micro capitalism. We're talking about macro, the big picture capitalism. So Powell was really threatened by Ralph Nader, who was a consumer advocate, and that was just crossing the line. Consumer advocacy against a corporation's ability to produce a profit was just too much. We couldn't put up with that. So that's why he writes the memo. And everybody he disagrees with is either a socialist, communist, or, the opposite of capitalism is socialism, communism, or fascism. This is the way he puts it. So it's one of these, you're either with me or against me. It's either A or B. There's no gray area in between. Well, to be perfectly clear, most of Europe is much more socialistic than we are here in America. The socialism in America that we have is corporate socialism, which seems to be okay. And that's pretty much what Powell is all about. He's about expanding the rights of the corporation. Let me just jump over to the little board here for a second. I wrote down here the corporate privilege, 1978. So a few years after, while he's on the Supreme Court, he's responsible for the First National Bank of Boston versus Roosevelt-y. And in this particular case they're concerning the corporation's ability to put out ads that they were trying to stop the anti-tobacco people from putting out true ads about the scientifically proven negative effects of cigarette smoking. And they tried to stop that, and that's what this Roosevelt-y was about. And basically, he invents a First Amendment right of the corporation to intercede like this. The second one that I had on the board over there was the Citizens United, which was in 2010. Citizens United, as most of you are pretty well aware, was the nail in the coffin. The nail in the coffin against consumer rights, individual rights, people rights, and in favor of it elevated the corporation to the level of an individual. Having said that, the corporation doesn't die, couldn't be put in jail. It didn't have the normal qualities of a human being, yet they did when it came to their ability to funnel money into political causes. And the thing that started this Citizens United was a group called Citizens United, and what they were trying to do, they were basically trying to stop They were putting on anti-Hillary ads when Hillary was running in the lead up to the 2008 election, and they were putting out ads. So it enabled them to dump all sorts of money to try to defeat Hillary, who I wouldn't exactly say was that anti-corporate, but I don't know where they got that from. So that's what we started with. So we've been going through this whole memo, and last week we ended with the starting to talk about the universities and the campuses. Well, I'm going to finish this up. Like I said, I'm going to finish this up today. Let me go to the board one more time. Let me come back over here. In the initial part of the memo, let me expand that. Let me stretch me in a little bit more there. Yeah, okay. Okay. We've got, so the memo is written in 71. The memo is written in 1971. And the Heritage Foundation is founded in 73, the Cato Institute in 74, the Federalist in 82. There's a couple of other, half a dozen really obscure foundations and institutes which crop up during this same time, with a whole list of right-wing conservative members on this. And the Hoover, I didn't list them here. The Hoover Institute was founded way back in 1920s, but it was a minimalist group until after this period of time here, when right prior to Reagan getting elected, their budget got increased about fourfold, and they became much more influential in the whole field. So the idea behind getting these institutions, the foundations and these societies, there weren't any intellectuals who knew what the hell was going on, that were out there writing about this. And what was going on that they wanted to write about was the corporate mindset. They wanted to create a corporate mindset. This document has been called by some people a blueprint for corporate dominance, crony capitalism manifesto, and basically they were molding the thinking of society. Now, in 1971, I've said this a few times now, I was working at AT&T and in colleges. I was right in the middle of the belly of the beast. I wouldn't exactly say AT&T had a reputation among the mass population as being a bad player. Hardly. But when you read the memo here, it sounds like these guys are floundering around and they have no control, and they're sort of been, they've had their knees cracked by somebody and they can't do anything. I mean, it makes no sense. A lot of stuff he talks about makes absolutely no sense. So what they wanted to do was, the whole goal was to create writers, thinkers, people who could speak, and send them to the universities, put them on TV and radio, and ultimately get them into the politicians. So they literally wanted to create people who thought in a corporate fashion. And if you go and look up any one of these, the Heritage, go back here. If you go look up the Heritage, the Cato, the Federalist, and you go to their home pages and read about what they're about, you're going to find out pretty quickly that they're about legal ways to ensure the dominance of the corporation one way or another. So that's what all these things were about. And they didn't have people that were supporting that position, because who would support that position other than somebody that worked in a corporation? Now, like I said, I was in the belly of the beast, and one of these weeks, maybe next week, I could do a show just on AT&T and my involvement with AT&T and how unscrupulous they were. I mean, it's not a big stretch. And I can trace their unscrupulousness when I worked for them to where they're at today. It hasn't changed. But the big thing was, they wanted to create they wanted to put an intellectual veneer and a logical explanations to get people to go to the universities, be on TV and radio, and affect politicians. Also, they covered books, magazines, and other things like this. Okay, let me go back to me here. So I sort of started ending up with about the universities, and how they were going to create the speaker staff and the speaker's bureaus and this whole type of thing. And then they talk about evaluating textbooks, and they have a whole little section, about half a page, about a list of scholars should evaluate social science textbooks, especially in economics, political science, and sociology. And he talks about how they need to go about this in order to get their more fair and balanced opinion into the thinking here. He then goes on to talk about getting equal time on campuses, because obviously everybody on the campuses is a raving Marxist, leftist. I don't know what campus this guy was on. He sure wasn't at the Chicago school, that's for sure. And then he said we need to balance the facilities, the faculties, that the faculties are too left-leaning. See, what happens with people as they think, the more they think, the more progressive they generally get. And because of that, the universities had a lot of progressive people in them. Well, he wants to balance that, balance those faculties, get some of those progressives out, get some more corporate, right-wing kinds of people in there. And then he goes on to elaborate about graduate schools of business, where they should give particular support to those graduate schools of business, because we have, they need to do the essential training for executives of the future. The executives of the future weren't being trained well enough. Let me tell you, they were being trained well enough, and it's why at AT&T in 1971 I watched people go to management schools and come back with ulcers continuously. They were being trained, and that's why they were getting the ulcers. He then talks about affecting secondary education, high schools, and they said, what can we do about the public? Well, we need to get into the area of paid advertising, and we need to affect some of the books that are out there, because there's too many of these books that are not in our favor. We need more business books for people to pay attention to. It really got my goat here when I got to about halfway through this thing, the neglected political arena. He goes on to say, it's Marx's doctrine that capitalist countries are controlled by big business. Hello? Capitalist countries are controlled by big business. This is Marx's doctrine, he said. This guy's got to be smoking some big weed or something. If I'm not mistaken, this goes back to like the 1920s and Herbert Hoover, and talking about the business of America is business. It is what the business of America is. It is business. And for him to say it's a Marxist doctrine is lunacy. These guys, they take some of these statements and they just misconstrue them. This doctrine is part of leftist propaganda all over the world and has a wide public following among Americans. Well, it wasn't a leftist propagandist who came up with the notion that the business of America is business. It was a goddamn Republican, for Christ's sake. Yet, as every business executive knows, few elements of American society have as little influence in government as the American businessman, the corporation, or even millions of corporate stockholders. I'm going to get back on this one in a second. The American business executive is truly the forgotten man. Can you believe this? 1971, this guy is saying business has very little influence on the American government, and the American business executive is the forgotten man. Current examples of the impotency of business are the stampede by politicians to support any legislation relating to consumerism or to the environment. He's basically saying any legislation that's going to improve the environment or to increase some consumer rights is indicative of the fact that the business is impotent, because the American business executive is the truly forgotten man. Well, I don't have it actually in front of me right now, but I did download, I mentioned it last week, I mentioned Eisenhower's famous talk about the military-industrial complex. Well, the military-industrial complex, industrial isn't exactly not business. It is business. And Eisenhower in the mid-50s is warning about the influence of business and government joined together I don't see where they're impotent. I don't see where they're forgotten. I don't know what this guy's talking about. But some right-wing loony will read this and go, oh yeah, sure, boy, those poor businessmen, we need to give them some more press here. I mentioned the corporate stockholders. Yeah, right, that was the one. Let me just, well, over here, that was the picture I've had up of Lewis Powell, who wrote the memo, and that's the actual original copy of the beginning of the memo right over here. But the one I wanted to put up, I've had this up a couple of times. In fact, I put it up on as a lead on the show about a week or so ago. That's the picture of Milton Friedman from with the article in Forbes magazine back in 1970. The origin of the world's dumbest idea. The origin of the world's dumbest idea. Now, what Friedman is talking about here is he takes two legal fictions, one legal fiction being a corporation, and he does this. This is Forbes magazine writing. This isn't Noam Chomsky or Richard Wolff or something like that, who's never on television, by the way. When was the last time you saw Noam Chomsky on a panel show about what's going on, or even Richard Wolff? You know, you don't see him either. What he's doing here, he does this what they call a conceptual sleight of hand. What he's attempting to say is that, and he calls it a wild fantasy, that the real owner of the organization, the real owner of the corporation, are the shareholders. The shareholders are the owners of the corporation. Not that the corporation is the entity here. Shareholders are a part of it. Management is a part of it. The customers are a part of it. No. The shareholders are the boss of the whole thing. That's what he's saying. And he does this with this mental mind setting. If you're really interested in this, Google it. The origin of the world's dumbest idea. It's mind-blowing to read this whole thing. But what's going on here, what he does is by making the shareholder the owner of the corporation, well, that's not going to be good enough to really pull this whole thing off. To ensure that I'm reading from the Forbes article, to ensure that the firms would focus solely on making money for their shareholders, firms should turn the executives into major shareholders by affording them generous compensation in the form of stock. In this way, the alleged tendency of executives to feather their own nest would be mobilized in the interest of the shareholders. So the tendency of executives to be greedy would be good for the rest of the shareholders, because the executive is going to be one of the shareholders. Now, when we're talking here around 1970s, this is an era when the difference between the top executives and the lower paid workers in a corporation was generally 50-1. So if somebody in the company was making a $10, let's say 1971, let's say somebody making $10 an hour in 1971, they work 40 hours a week, they're making $400 a week. The executive in that company, $10 an hour, would be making 50 times that. 50 times $10 an hour, or $500 an hour. $500 an hour. That was about the average. Well, that was the high average. It was more between, say, 35 times and 50 times. I've seen different numbers over the year. But it was, the high end was 50, the low end about 35. So this guy's making $10 an hour. These guys are making $350 to $500 an hour. That's not enough. I mean, Jesus, how can we live with a system like that? Now, capitalism itself, without doing anything to it by its very nature, has been pointed out in Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, will produce an inequality, because capital always makes more money than labor. Always. Inevitable. And this is like a 200-plus year study of statistics where they came up with this a couple of years ago. And if you really want to see an interesting example of this, look up the movie. It's available. It was on Kino. It may be available on Netflix. Capitalism in the 21st Century. It's a riff on Thomas Piketty's book. So he wants to make the CEO, the CFOs, he wants to give them compensation in the form of stock so that they want to increase the stock value of the company. Well, this is back in 1970. By the time we get to, let's just throw this up here too, on the side there. Put it on the side. I don't know if you notice the graph here, but we're talking return on investment to capital from 1965 to 2009. And you'll notice the graph is going steadily downward, steadily downward. What's happening is the corporations over this period of time are actually making less money. They're not increasing the return on the invested capital. The shareholder capital executive compensation is exploding while the corporate performance is declining. So the corporations are literally making 2, 3, 4, on an average, more like from, let's say, 3 to 6%, maybe 3, 4%. A couple of times even more than that, maybe even 6% during a couple of periods. Well, the crash, okay, 2001. So in general, the compensation is going down from, say, 6.5% to, say, 4.5%. So it's going down a solid 2% over this period of time, from the mid-70s up until 2009. Now, executive salaries at the same time, executive salaries from 1980 to 1990, they double. And then from 1990 to 2000, they quadruple. So first they double, then they quadruple. So then we wind up, by the time we get to 2000 and to this period we're in today, the executive salaries are in many cases 10 times higher. So the guy making $10 an hour at the bottom, the guy above him is making $3,500 an hour. 350 to 500 times what the guy at the bottom is making. 350 to 500 times. So by making the CEOs executives or shareholders, their total focus is on increasing the shareholder value. They're making a fortune. The company itself is drifting downward, but they're making a fortune. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. And the fact that, repeating it again, that Forbes magazine, the Forbes magazine, in fact, I'll bring myself in from the left here. This wasn't in 2000. This was in 2013. This is 2013 when they came up with this fact that, and they point out how over the years, a lot of, he was called like the smartest guy around, and he gets all these awards and Nobel Prizes and blah, blah, blah. And he's the guy who basically introduces us to trickle-down economics, or supply-side economics, which was aptly described in the movie the Bonfires of the Vanity, where Tom Hanks is describing how somebody has a cake, and when they, or the wife describes it, not Tom Hanks, he's the executive. The wife describes how you have a little birthday cake, and when you cut the cake, some of the crumbs fall down, and Daddy collects the crumbs. Well, the daddy that's collecting the crumbs is the executive who's putting the deal together. Is there anything filtering through for the people below that even? Less than crumbs. Less than crumbs. So, okay. The American executive, truly a forgotten man. I mean, this thing just stuck out to me so heavily. It wound up being half the show here tonight. We got 5 minutes to go. He ends this whole deal by getting into television. Neglected opportunities in the court. Right, I almost forgot that one. Right. The judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change. Let's go back to the other guy. No, over here, sorry. The corporate privilege from the 1978 Bank of Boston to Citizens United. So when he says here in 1971 that the courts, the judiciary, may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change, as we flipping back here, affecting politicians, leading us to the ultimate greedy gangster, narcissist, grift artist that this country has ever produced, leading us to Donald Trump, whose realizing the power of the judiciary, his main goal was to get more and more of his right-wing libertarian justices into the legal system. And he thought he would be able to control it. Well, as it turned out, some of them were actually able to think on their own and rejected some of his claims for that the voting fraud was happening. The neglected stockholder power. Yeah, I talked about this whole thing. This was the paragraph about the stockholder power was towards the end of the whole document. He says, there's almost a total failure to appreciate that business actually embraces most Americans. Those for whom business provides jobs constitute a fairly obvious class. But the 20 million stockholders, most of whom are the modest means, are the real owners. So you 20 million stockholders out there, is that over there, and a couple of million there, yeah. You 20 million people out there, you're modest means, right? You're living in a fairly middle class kind of moderate house and watching your grocery bills and everything. Stockholders have been as ineffectual as business executives in promoting a genuine understanding of our system or in exercising political influence. Now, Milton Friedman, who I pointed out over here before, Milton Friedman was the one economist that Powell talks about in the early pages of this whole document here, raising him up to the level of some saintly kind of person. Okay, he sort of gets, he finishes the thing up with how much it's going to cost us to do this, a few places we can raise some money, things like that. And he ends it with the relationship to freedom. This is another one. So in the relationship, which is the last page of the memo. The threat to the enterprise system is not merely a matter of economics, it's also a threat to individual freedom. And this is where you wind up with the thinking today, where you got these bozos out there with yelling about their freedom and don't take away my my Medicare, but down with the government and Jesus saves, and I got to be free to punch a Capitol Police officer in the face and beat him on the head. That's my freedom. The threat to the enterprise system is a matter of economics. The threat to individual freedom. A lot of your right-wing politicians have made these connections, which is how they wind up with people like the Proud Boys on their side. Most of the essential freedoms remain. He says, in spite of things big, most of our essential freedoms remain. The first essential freedom is obviously private ownership. And private profit is before that, next after that. Then we go to labor unions and collective bargaining. Well, if you remember or looked historically at the 80s, the labor unions have been eviscerated, and collective bargaining is a thing of the past. You read about it about once every 5 months in a progressive magazine or something, that it's something we wish we had. Consumer choice. In other words, as long as I got 5 products out there and you have a choice between the 5, you can get a blue, a red, a green, a white, yellow, blue. That's okay. Well, it doesn't matter if this one's broken. Oops. Oh, you cut your hand on that one. Oh, this blew up on you. No, that's okay. The essential matter is that you have a choice between them. And the last freedom is a market economy in which competition largely determines price, quality, and variety of the goods and services provided to the consumer. Now, I don't know how aware you are of the competition we have in this country today, but I believe he was on, somebody was on, pretty bright guy was on Bill Maher's show the other night. Blew my socks off. He was a professor. He was a professor, in fact. He was lecturing every time he spoke and got big applause and everything. The top 5 companies, the top 5 companies control about 50% of the stock market, or the Standard & Poor's, I believe, today. A huge portion of the market is controlled by about 5 different companies. The bigger the companies get, the more they eat up other people and the less competition there is. The good example, which I've been aware of and Bill Maher brought up the other night, Amazon wanted to get rid of a diaper company. They weren't selling diapers. It was this really nice little company. They were selling good quality diapers at a reasonable price. Amazon wasn't getting the diaper business. Well, Bezos loses something like $150 million over a period so that he can put out cheaper diapers to compete with this guy and put him out of business. This is the business model for Amazon. This was the business model for Whole Foods, which is another major topic I will talk about at a later date. I'm just going to finish it with a note about the footnotes. And the last footnote I wanted to mention was he's had a whole bunch of, we'll just go with the last footnote I was going to mention. In 1971, Jack Newfield, who wrote for the Village Voice, and I used to read, an ultra-liberal Jack Newfield, he argued that, quote, the root need in our country is to redistribute wealth. What a concept. What a concept. When they talk about the redistribution of wealth, the image you get in your head is this market, socialism, capitalism. We're going to mix this whole thing together. But if the head of the company is making 350 to 500 times what the guy at the bottom is making, do you think there's a problem here in terms of the distribution of the wealth? The poor in this country have increased greatly over the last 50 years. Biden, at the very least, with this COVID bill, has attacked that whole thing from a very Rooseveltian viewpoint, and he's trying to lift the poor out of the poverty that they've been crushed into over the last 50 years. Powell is diametrically against Roosevelt and feels like Roosevelt is the socialist who wrecked America, which is why he wants to restore this corporate power. So I think we did the Powell memo. I think that's about it. If you've got any questions or anything else, or you want me to look up something, I'll look into it a little deeper. In the meantime, I hopefully can get to a different topic next week, and maybe we'll post a couple of poems up. But peace, patience, persistence, and we'll see you as soon as we can.